In 1990, political scientist Francis Fukuyama published an essay titled The End of History. His thesis was bold. Liberal democracy had triumphed decisively over all competing ideologies. The Cold War was over, the Soviet Union was collapsing, and American-led liberal capitalism would dominate globally for the foreseeable future. This wasn't arrogance. It was what the evidence seemed to suggest. America stood alone as the world's sole superpower, unchallenged militarily, economically, or ideologically. 35 years later, Saudi Arabia sells oil to China in yuan, not dollars. Brazil and India conduct bilateral trade in local currencies, bypassing the dollar entirely. Canada, America's closest ally and most integrated trading partner, is deliberately reducing its export dependence on the United States from 75% to 60%. The BRICS group has expanded beyond its original 5 members, with over 40 nations expressing interest in joining an explicitly anti-hegemonic bloc. This isn't the collapse of American power. America remains militarily formidable, economically massive, and technologically advanced. But it's the emergence of something historically significant. A world where America is powerful but no longer central. The post-American order isn't coming. It's already here. And understanding how we arrived at this moment requires examining the gradual erosion of American centrality over 3 decades. The 1990s represented what scholars call the unipolar moment. The Soviet Union's dissolution left America without peer competitors. American military power was unmatched. The Gulf War demonstrated technological superiority that seemed almost unfair. American economic institutions set global rules through the IMF, World Bank, and WTO. American culture dominated globally through Hollywood, technology, and consumer brands. The Washington Consensus on Economic Policy, free markets, privatization, deregulation, was accepted globally as the path to prosperity. This dominance wasn't just military or economic, it was institutional. Post-World War II, America built a network of alliances, treaties, and international organizations that made American power legitimate and durable. NATO provided security. The Bretton Woods institutions managed finance. The United Nations, while imperfect, gave American preferences international legitimacy. This institutional architecture meant American power wasn't just imposed, it was accepted, often welcomed. But this system contained seeds of its own transformation. The institutions America built were designed to be universal and rules-based. This created expectations that America itself would follow the rules. When America appeared to violate those rules, it undermined the system's legitimacy. And other nations, having grown economically within the American-led system, gained the capability to build alternatives. The 2000s marked the beginning of visible cracks. The Iraq War in 2003 was the inflection point. America invaded Iraq based on claims about weapons of mass destruction that proved false. The invasion lacked UN Security Council authorization. Many traditional allies opposed it. The occupation became a costly quagmire. The war damaged American credibility and demonstrated limits to American power. Military force couldn't easily reshape societies or impose political outcomes. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated the shift. The crisis originated in American financial institutions, spread globally through American-dominated financial networks, and required unprecedented interventions to prevent complete collapse. The narrative that American-style capitalism represented the optimal system became harder to sustain when that system had just nearly destroyed the global economy. Meanwhile, China's rise continued steadily. While America fought wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, China invested in infrastructure, education, and industrial capacity. Chinese GDP growth averaged near 10% annually through the 2000s. By 2010, China had become the world's second-largest economy and largest trading partner for most nations. This wasn't just economic statistics. It represented a fundamental shift in global economic gravity. The 2010s saw the emergence of institutional alternatives to American-dominated structures. In 2013, China launched the Belt and Road Initiative, a trillion-dollar infrastructure program spanning Asia, Africa, and Europe. This provided an alternative development model to Western institutions that often imposed strict conditions. In 2015, China established the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, with over 50 member nations, including American allies like the UK, Germany, and Australia, who joined despite American opposition. The BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, began creating their own institutions. The new development bank, established in 2014, provided financing for infrastructure projects without the conditions imposed by the World Bank. The contingent reserve arrangement offered an alternative to IMF emergency lending. These weren't just symbolic gestures. They were functional institutions handling real money and real projects. De-dollarization accelerated as a deliberate strategy. For decades, the dollar's role as global reserve currency gave America enormous advantages: the ability to run trade deficits indefinitely, borrow cheaply, and impose effective sanctions by denying access to dollar-based financial systems. But this also created vulnerabilities for other nations. If America could freeze Iranian or Russian assets held in dollars, any country potentially faced similar risks. The response has been systematic diversification. Central banks globally have been reducing dollar reserves and increasing holdings in euros, yuan, and gold. China and Russia settled increasing amounts of bilateral trade in local currencies. In 2023, Saudi Arabia, a cornerstone of the petrodollar system since the 1970s, began accepting yuan for oil sales to China. This wasn't complete abandonment of the dollar, but it represented a significant crack in dollar hegemony. Trade architecture shifted toward regional blocs that often excluded America. The Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, RCEP, created the world's largest free trade area spanning 15 Asia-Pacific nations, including China, Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN members. Notably absent, the United States. The agreement covered 30% of global GDP and 30% of the world's population, creating an integrated Asian economic space that didn't require American participation. The significance of RCEP extends beyond its size. It represents Asian nations choosing economic integration that includes China, rather than waiting for American leadership. The Obama administration's Trans-Pacific Partnership was explicitly designed to set rules for Asian trade that would constrain China. When Trump withdrew from TPP in 2017, Asian nations didn't wait for America to reconsider. They proceeded with RCEP, which includes China and excludes America. The economic implications are substantial. Supply chains within RCEP members become more integrated and efficient. Trade barriers fall. Investment flows increase. Over time, this creates an Asian economic sphere that is largely self-sufficient. American companies can still access these markets, but they're operating in a system they didn't design and don't control. The rules are set by Asian nations for Asian interests. Beyond RCEP, bilateral and plurilateral agreements proliferate across Asia without American involvement. The Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the reformed version of TPP without America, links 11 Pacific Rim nations. ASEAN has free trade agreements with China, India, Japan, Korea, Australia, and New Zealand. These create an overlapping web of commitments that bind Asian economies together increasingly tightly. Europe's response to American unreliability during the Trump administration accelerated European strategic autonomy initiatives. When Trump questioned NATO commitments and imposed tariffs on European steel and aluminum, European leaders concluded they couldn't rely on American security guarantees indefinitely. France's Macron declared NATO brain-dead in 2019. The EU committed to developing independent military capabilities. European defense spending increased, but increasingly focused on European-led capabilities rather than American equipment and command structures. The Middle East underwent realignment largely independent of American influence. The most dramatic example came in 2023, when China brokered a détente between Saudi Arabia and Iran, longtime regional rivals whose conflict had shaped Middle Eastern politics for decades. This wasn't American diplomacy. It was China demonstrating that it could play the role of regional mediator that America traditionally occupied. The Saudi-Iran rapprochement had profound implications. For 40 years, the Saudi-Iran rivalry had driven regional conflicts. Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, Iraq all reflected this competition. American policy had largely aligned with Saudi Arabia and Gulf Arab states against Iran. China, lacking ideological commitments to either side, could position itself as an honest broker in ways America couldn't. The agreement wasn't just symbolic. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations, reopened embassies, and committed to security cooperation. While implementation remains partial and trust-limited, the fact that it happened at all and happened through Chinese mediation represented a fundamental shift. Middle Eastern nations were solving Middle Eastern problems without American involvement or approval. This reflects broader regional patterns. Gulf states diversified partnerships, maintaining American security relationships while developing economic and political ties with China, Russia, Turkey, and other powers. The UAE emerged as a major trading hub connecting Asia, Africa, and Europe. Saudi Arabia pursued its Vision 2030 economic diversification with investments from multiple partners. Turkey leveraged its geography and military capabilities to play independent regional roles in Syria, Libya, and the Caucasus. Israel's normalization agreements with Gulf states proceeded with American involvement, but didn't depend on American mediation the way previous Middle East peace processes had. Turkey positioned itself as an independent regional power, maintaining relations with Russia despite being a NATO member, and pursuing its own interests in Syria, Libya, and the Eastern Mediterranean, often contrary to American preferences. Canada's $500 billion diversification strategy represents perhaps the most significant indicator of the post-American order's arrival. If even America's closest ally and most economically integrated partner is deliberately reducing dependence, it signals that American reliability is fundamentally questioned. Canadian officials explicitly stated the strategy aimed to ensure Canada would never again be vulnerable to American tariff threats or policy unpredictability. The mechanics of Canada's approach are instructive. The plan mobilizes $500 billion in private investment over 5 years through government incentives, explicitly structured to reduce American market dependence from 75% to below 60% of exports. This isn't hostile to America, it's risk management, but it represents a calculation that, depending heavily on any single partner, even a traditionally reliable one, has become strategically unacceptable. This pattern, traditional American allies reducing dependence while maintaining relationships, defines the post-American order. These nations aren't joining an anti-American bloc. They're creating strategic autonomy so they aren't vulnerable to American policy swings. But the cumulative effect is a world where American preferences matter less because other nations have alternatives. The institutional architecture reflects this shift. Payment systems that bypass SWIFT are operational. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, processes trillions in transactions. Russia's SPFS system allows sanctioned entities to conduct financial transactions outside Western oversight. These systems are less efficient than SWIFT, but they function adequately, and adequacy is sufficient for countries seeking to reduce vulnerability to Western financial sanctions. Development financing increasingly flows through non-Western institutions. The Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank has approved over $40 billion in projects. The New Development Bank has loaned billions for infrastructure in member states. These institutions don't replace the World Bank and IMF, but they provide alternatives. Countries seeking development financing now have choices, and those choices come with different conditions and different political strings. The technology sector shows similar fragmentation. China has built a largely independent technology ecosystem. Chinese consumers use WeChat, not WhatsApp, Alibaba and JD.com, not Amazon, Baidu, not Google. TikTok succeeded globally despite American attempts to ban it. Chinese semiconductor manufacturing, while still behind cutting-edge Western technology, is advancing and increasingly adequate for most applications. This technology bifurcation has profound implications. During the Cold War, the West and Soviet bloc had separate technology systems, but the Soviet system was clearly inferior. The emerging bifurcation is different. Chinese technology is competitive, often superior in specific domains, and integrated into a massive domestic market. This creates a real alternative technology ecosystem that other countries can access if they face restrictions from Western technology providers. Consider specific examples. Huawei, despite American sanctions and chip restrictions, continues developing 5G infrastructure that many nations prefer for cost and performance reasons. Chinese electric vehicle manufacturers like BYD now compete globally with Tesla and traditional automakers. Chinese renewable energy technology, solar panels, wind turbines, battery storage, dominates global markets on price and increasingly on quality. The semiconductor challenge illustrates both Chinese limitations and determination. China still cannot manufacture cutting-edge chips at 3nm or 5nm process nodes that American and allied companies produce. But for most applications, consumer electronics, automotive, industrial equipment, 14nm or 28nm chips are adequate. China is investing hundreds of billions to achieve self-sufficiency at these nodes and making steady progress despite Western technology restrictions. The broader point is that technological leadership is fragmenting. America leads in certain areas: advanced semiconductors, aerospace, some software. China leads in others: manufacturing technology, some AI applications, renewable energy at scale. Europe leads in some domains: industrial machinery, chemical engineering. The unipolar moment where American technology was clearly superior across all domains has ended. Military power remains overwhelmingly American in conventional terms, but even here, the picture is complex. China's Navy now outnumbers the U.S. Navy in total vessels. Chinese missile technology in some areas matches or exceeds American capabilities. More importantly, China doesn't need to match American global power projection. It only needs to deter American intervention in its regional sphere, particularly regarding Taiwan. And that threshold is increasingly achievable. Regional powers have greater freedom to act independently because the unipolar American dominance that made regional power projection risky no longer exists. Turkey can intervene in Syria and Libya, pursue drone warfare capabilities, and maintain relationships with Russia despite NATO membership. India can purchase Russian weapons while partnering with America in the Quad. Brazil can lead Latin American diplomacy, often contrary to American preferences. This isn't multipolarity in the traditional sense of multiple great powers balancing each other. It's something more complex: a world with one superpower, America, several major powers, China, EU, India, Russia, many significant regional powers, Turkey, Brazil, Indonesia, Saudi Arabia, and increasingly dense networks of cooperation that don't require American participation or approval. The Global South is particularly important in this transformation. For decades, most developing nations had limited choices: accept Western development models and conditions, or face isolation. Now alternatives exist. China offers infrastructure financing without political conditions. BRICS institutions provide development lending. Regional powers offer political and economic partnerships. The Global South has agency it lacked during the unipolar moment. This manifests concretely across regions. African nations can now choose between Chinese infrastructure loans, Western development assistance, Turkish construction companies, Gulf Arab investment, and Indian technical cooperation. Each option comes with different terms and different implications. This competition for influence benefits African nations by giving them negotiating leverage they previously lacked. Latin America demonstrates similar dynamics. When Venezuela faced Western sanctions, China and Russia provided financial lifelines. When Argentina needed development financing, China offered currency swaps and infrastructure investment outside IMF conditionality. Brazil, under various governments, has leveraged its position to extract favorable terms from multiple partners, rather than depending solely on American markets and institutions. Southeast Asian nations have become particularly adept at playing major powers against each other. The Philippines maintains American security relationships while expanding Chinese economic ties. Vietnam balances American strategic partnerships against historical Chinese influence. Indonesia positions itself as a neutral hub, attracting investment from all sides. Thailand's military government maintained relations with both China and America, despite American disapproval of the coup. This isn't just pragmatism, it's structural. When only one patron exists, client states have little leverage. When multiple patrons compete, client states can extract better terms. The post-American order creates space for middle and smaller powers to exercise agency that the unipolar moment constrained. This manifests in international institutions. The UN General Assembly votes increasingly diverge from American preferences. When the U.S. called for condemning Russia's Ukraine invasion, many nations abstained, not because they approved of invasion, but because they saw an opportunity to demonstrate independence. The same nations that might have reflexively aligned with the West during the Cold War now calculate their interests independently. The post-American order doesn't mean American decline in absolute terms. American GDP continues growing. American military technology remains advanced. American universities still attract global talent. Silicon Valley still produces innovation. But relative to others, American dominance has eroded substantially, and in international relations, relative power matters more than absolute power. Consider the metrics. In 1990, American GDP was roughly 25% of global GDP. By 2020, it was about 15%, still enormous, but proportionally smaller as other economies grew. In 1990, the US dollar comprised about 70% of global foreign exchange reserves. By 2024, it was closer to 55%, still dominant, but declining and the trend continuing downward. American allies and partners now routinely make major decisions without consulting Washington, or sometimes contrary to American preferences. European nations proceeded with Nord Stream 2 pipeline despite American opposition. Asian nations joined China's AIIB despite American pressure not to. Middle Eastern nations normalized relations with Syria over American objections. These aren't anti-American decisions, but they're not pro-American either. They're independent decisions based on perceived self-interest. The COVID-19 pandemic accelerated these trends. China's domestic response, while authoritarian, appeared more effective than chaotic American responses. Chinese vaccines went to developing nations when Western vaccines were scarce. China's supply chain dominance became undeniable when the world desperately needed PPE and medical equipment that overwhelmingly came from Chinese factories. The Ukraine war further accelerated fragmentation. The West imposed unprecedented sanctions on Russia, expecting global compliance. Instead, most of the world declined to participate. India dramatically increased Russian oil imports. China maintained Russian trade relationships. Much of Africa, Latin America, and Asia continued business largely as usual. The sanctions worked in isolating Russia from Western economies, but they revealed that Western economies no longer constitute the global economy in the way they once did. The voting patterns at the UN illustrate this starkly. The March 2022 resolution condemning Russian aggression passed overwhelmingly. 141 nations voted yes. But the abstention list was revealing. China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, South Africa, and over 30 other nations representing billions of people refused to condemn Russia. These weren't pro-Russia votes. They were assertions of independence from Western preferences. When Western nations pushed for more aggressive anti-Russia measures, support weakened further. A resolution to suspend Russia from the UN Human Rights Council passed with only 93 votes in favor, 24 voted against, and 58 abstained. The Global South's message was clear. We won't support Russia's invasion, but we also won't subordinate our interests to Western preferences. Economically, the sanctions created opportunities that non-Western nations exploited. Indian refiners bought discounted Russian crude, refined it, and sold refined products to Europe, technically complying with European sanctions while ensuring Russian oil still reached European markets through intermediary steps. Turkey became a major transshipment point for goods flowing between Russia and the West. UAE's trade with Russia surged as it became a hub for circumventing sanctions. The broader implication was profound. Western sanctions, even coordinated across all major Western economies, couldn't achieve complete global compliance. The non-Western world, representing the majority of global population and increasingly large share of global GDP, chose not to participate. This revealed the limits of Western economic power in the post-American order. What would reversing these trends require? The answer is daunting. America would need to rebuild the institutional legitimacy that made its leadership accepted rather than merely tolerated. This would require consistent adherence to rules America expects others to follow. It would require offering terms of partnership that others find more attractive than alternatives. It would require policy reliability and predictability that recent decades have not demonstrated. None of this seems politically feasible in current American domestic politics. The foreign policy consensus that maintained institutional leadership during the Cold War has collapsed. One political coalition questions whether maintaining global institutions serves American interests. The other struggles to articulate why American leadership matters when that leadership is regularly undermined by the other coalition when it gains power. Meanwhile, other powers are building the post-American order, not through confrontation, but through construction. China builds institutions, infrastructure, and relationships. The EU develops strategic autonomy and regulatory power. Regional powers like India, Turkey, and Brazil exercise increasing independence. The Global South collectively pursues options that maximize autonomy. The emerging order isn't necessarily worse than the American-led order, nor necessarily better. It's more fragmented, more complex, with multiple centers of power rather than one dominant center. Historical precedent is mixed. Multipolar systems have maintained peace through balance, but have also collapsed into devastating wars. What's certain is that the unipolar moment has ended. The post-American order is already operational. The question isn't whether America can restore the dominance of the 1990s. That's not achievable given the fundamental changes in global economic and political distribution of power. The question is whether America can adapt to being powerful but not dominant, influential but not controlling, important but not central. The great risk is that American political culture, formed during a century of increasing global dominance, cannot psychologically adjust to this reality. If America insists on acting as if the unipolar moment continues while the rest of the world has moved on, the result will be costly mistakes, damaged relationships, and accelerated marginalization. The world is moving without waiting for American permission or participation. New institutions are being built. New relationships are forming. New systems are becoming operational. America can participate in shaping this emerging order, but it can no longer dictate terms. That's not decline. It's historical adjustment to the reality that the exceptional circumstances of 1990 couldn't persist indefinitely. The post-American order is here. The question is whether America recognizes it and adapts accordingly, or whether it continues operating based on assumptions about American centrality that no longer reflect reality. The world will move forward either way. The only question is whether America moves with it or gets left behind.